Hello.
Hi, everyone.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to EnvironMental Podcast.
Yeah, this is our podcast where we investigate different aspects of sustainability and we come in at you every week.
That's true, and we are back again with part 2 of going over the book Black Food Matters by Ashanté Reese and Hanna Garth. And it's my turn now.
Yeah.
Last week, Ob shared.
Yeah, I talked about the first half of the book and how important I think we both feel this book is really important to the work. And yeah, I'm super excited to hear about your thoughts on this in the second half.
Yeah. So we decided to split this one up because it's a series of smaller pieces of work. And so, it's kind of broken up into a bunch of different subtopics, all about Black food and the history of Black food. And so if that's interesting to you, then you can check this out or go watch part 1 first, or subscribe to our channel, like what we're doing. Cool. Yeah,
because the algorithm wants to know that you want content about sustainability.
yes. And this is an important aspect of it, right? The social piece and racial justice, and it's a very important part of it is kind of understanding how racism permeates throughout pretty much every part of life. Yeah. So it wasn't, I don't even know where to begin. So the parts that I read the second half of this book, and a lot of it is about cultural appropriation of sort of traditional food.
Okay.
Traditional foods from people of color. And that was sort of the biggest overall theme, was just how kind of rampant cultural appropriation is when it comes to food, and especially just in the kind of more traditional restaurant industry, which is very white, and still has a lot of weird kind of hierarchy and power structures in it, in terms of kind of head chefs and then prep cooks and dishwashers and stuff. So it's sort of an interesting kind of holdover from, rather, I guess it's sort of an interesting microcosm of racial injustices that happen specifically in how white people co-opt kind of these ideas, call them their own, or say that they're inventing something new. And it's like this new hip restaurant, and you're like, wait, this isn't new. This is, we've all seen it, right? We've all probably likely been to some sort of like a hip, like infusion restaurant that does some sort of like, Latin or like Afro-Caribbean or barbecue food. And they just kind of do it in maybe a slightly different way. Or it's some kind of like hybrid. But those ideas aren't from the actual chef's culture. They're kind of taken from other lower ranked chefs, which is really interesting.
Can you elaborate on why it's problematic?
Yeah. Well, yeah. So essentially, I mean, so much of people's culture starts and centers around food. And when when a white person uses their privilege to take the concepts of a different culture and calls it new. There's a concrete example, which I'll get to because that's actually kind of at the end of the book, where oddly enough, these chefs in Miami called this kind of Afro-Caribbean kind of Cuban food, they called it New World food.
Okay. So it's problematic when it's not like this is a traditional African dish or like
Yeah, it's kind of simultaneously like sterilizing the history of that particular food because it's not recognizing the cultural significance of where that food came from and the people that have been making that food for so long. And in fact, the people who have been making that food for so long, would never have been able to run their own restaurant creating that traditional food. And I guess I'll start with sort of with barbecue, because I think that's a really interesting example. So like, if it's just sort of an interesting concept. Like, current barbecue culture in America almost entirely overlooks the connection and the importance of this barbecue practice from African American culture and history. And it tends to, which I think we touched on a little bit last episode, where if a Black person was to, talk about barbecue or talk about that being their favorite food, it's often looked at as unhealthy or written off as just like not some sort of like culinary new thing. But if some white person was to like open up a barbecue spot in like a hip part of town because they have access to investors and have access to real estate, it wouldn't have that negative connotation. And so the problem is just that both of those exist, that both of those things are true, that like if someone with African descent wanted to open up an African restaurant, it wouldn't be thought of as new, and it wouldn't be, it just kind of often gets discounted as yeah. And it's just essentially, it's all rooted in just this indirect kind of white supremacist attitude in a way, where white chefs are just highly favored, like by American society. And it's a strange thing. Like they're really, I think that one example was like, there haven't been a whole lot of people of color that have won like Michelin stars in the like high-end food like restaurant awards.
Yeah.
I think,
is that like a ratio, or
it didn't give an exact ratio at all, but that was just an example that was given.
Okay. Yeah, I'm curious because about like if that's because Black folks have less access to spaces where Michelin star people eat food, so that's like there's less, we know that there's like less Black entrepreneurs in the chef space, in the food space. But or if it's because out of the people that are Black folks in the food space comparatively with white folks in the food space, they get a Michelin star at a lower rate, is sort of where my mind goes with that. But yeah.
It's a good
Probably
question, and I
both.
don't have that information. I probably would imagine that it is both, but it's just sort of they really spent these chapters really highlighting how in restaurant culture um, we commodify otherism. That's like the
Mhm.
hot new thing when it's like it spices up white culture to be able to say like, oh, I went to like an Asian fusion restaurant, and it's not weird if a restaurant has both Thai food and sushi. And because to white people that's just like, oh, I'm going to the Asian restaurant, but like if you actually think about that, like those are two completely
Totally
different
different.
cultures,
Yeah.
completely different styles of food, and two
Right.
completely different histories that were essentially and potentially you know unknowingly erasing.
Mhm.
And yeah, so it did a really interesting job at kind of giving a few examples of that, the first of course being in barbecue culture.
Yeah.
um, and then yeah, there was also an interesting section about the need for community gardens and for and that community gardens can in and of itself be an act of resistance, which is also something that we kind of talked about last week.
Yeah,
um
indeed.
yeah, and but the it's almost a direct response to the lack of access, right? So it's like in these communities of color there were um smaller local markets for a long time. There were also those like street vendors and people who would just and just farmers who would just work kind of on trade. And
Yeah.
then grocery stores came in, and
Right.
grocery stores kind of took over all of that and put pretty essentially everybody else out of business.
Mhm.
But because these grocery stores are nationwide, they don't feel connected to the community whatsoever. And
Right.
in times where there's economic downturn, they're going to make a business decision, and they have and do make business decisions to just up and leave those
Right.
areas. And so, yeah, once again, communities of color are sort of left to having to do it on their own.
Yeah.
And and so there was this kind of rise in thinking of farming as an act of resistance. Um, but they brought up this really interesting lawsuit, this case of in which the USDA, um, which is the U.S. Department of Agriculture, was sued
Mhm.
for racial discrimination in
Mhm.
1999.
Whoa.
Yeah, so this was not that long ago. This was not that long ago at all that there was still overt systemic racism in parts of the federal government. And this lawsuit essentially was saying that because the USDA is in charge of sort of allocating aid and funds
Yeah.
to farmers. Because we subsidize as a country our farmers and give,
Mhm.
yeah, kind of allocate resources in some way. I don't know all of the details. um, but the USDA knew that Black farmers were not being provided with aid in the same way that white farmers were. It was
Oh.
like clear and overt. And so that was the basis of the lawsuit. And
Okay.
and they won. But the farmers essentially received $65,000 each in settlements, but I don't think that
Which is
really.
a lot. It's a lot for a farm, but like, did it solve the problem? like what changed? Did
What
it make
changed?
what?
Yeah, yeah. They mentioned that, that like not too long after Obama had a speech and he addressed Black farmers, um, and they created an act that would specifically kind of help to target racial injustice in farming.
Mhm.
But it it did no, I think that it did not fully address like kind of the root of why that was able to happen in the first place. And
Right.
the USDA is it's just sort of there. A quote is racism permeated the USDA. It
Yeah.
was in everything. And yeah, and yeah, essentially there were just some pretty bad guys that were at the head of the USDA during this time, where not only were they kind of really pushing these just racial injustices, but they were also um, like highly promoting large scale farming operations and in effect essentially killing small farms
Well,
at the same time. So these were the
yeah.
same people that were doing this around this time.
Yeah.
And
Hungry communities aren't an accident,
right,
like we talked about last time.
right. Yeah. And it's crazy to see that like that almost, I mean, I'm not going to say that that single-handedly came down to like this. His name was his last name was Butts, Mr. Butts, was the head of the USDA. Yeah. Uh, in at the time, it's like, or I think early 2000s. So it's just not a coincidence that these things were happening around the same time. It's really, and it's just sort of an interesting fact to know about. But I don't think that it, did a whole lot to actually address issues. I think that there were also additional class action lawsuits against the USDA, like even more recently than that. Um, the one that was mentioned in the book is called Pigford versus Glickman. But it does look like there were more recent lawsuits up until 2004, potentially 2009, of again racially discriminatory practices throughout the late 90s and early 2000s
In the USDA.
in the USDA.
Okay.
Yes. Hmm.
I like I think that that's good information because um especially to share, like we'll share a little bit more about that on the Living Brand directory, which you guys should follow. Um because our justice system works a lot on I just had the word and I've lost it. On I lost the word. But on choosing making decisions based on prior decisions, precedents. Our
Mm,
justice makes a lot of decisions based on precedents.
yeah.
And when things like the USDA, like it's the USDA, but it's still part of the federal government. So that sets a precedent for the federal government being sued for overt racism, which is something you can use as a precedent in another case if and when, because we're going to see that coming up, quite a bit more. That is used. That could very well be cited as a precedent for like this is possible. Here's
Yeah.
what happened, and here's, you know.
Right. Because absolutely there is no way that it was just this agency that was, continuing to kind of just allow these things to happen. And yeah, it's not new. And yeah, but I think it's just not, it's not something that you actively like hear about. I've never, I mean, perhaps that was bigger news back then. We were quite young
Yeah.
in the early 2000s, so that makes sense that we wouldn't really be privy to that. But yeah, I at no point did I ever learn that the USDA was sued for racial discrimination. That's
And lost. Yeah.
and lost. Yeah, there were additional lawsuits that I think didn't quite go through, but yeah, there were definitely they settled, essentially. Yeah. But
That's interesting.
it is, and it's, I think then, so the way that the book was structured, it was sort of, it started with the barbecue piece and talking about cultural appropriation, and then it moved into, here's why Black farmers kind of started being the answer to this problem that they were facing. But then it sort of ended in talking about a different example of cultural appropriation in restaurants. So the way, yeah. So I thought that structure was a little interesting. But essentially it's just citing more examples in history of the same systems happening, right? And it just continues to highlight these holdovers of white supremacy and these kind of capitalist driven kind of colonial based ideologies, where if it's something new to us being the white person, we can take it and it's just new and we can take it and sell it. And I mean, that's the,
yeah,
that happens every day in everything about Black culture gets co-opted and commodified by white culture eventually.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it was just sort of the example that they gave was again about Cubans in Miami, and how in the, I believe, 70s, like the government was allowing Cubans to come into the States, and so they were giving aid. And so that allowed for a large population of Cubans to kind of settle in Miami. But the problem was that the group of Cubans that were more able to, quote unquote, like assimilate and to kind of create that strong culture were the lighter complected individuals, and the more Afro-Caribbeans were left out. It just kind of never quite trickled down to the darker complected Cubans.
Even from the same culture, even from the same place.
Yeah, and that is often an unfortunate sort of side effect of white supremacy, is that it creates these divides amongst cultures of people of color as well, where it creates this divide of dark skin and light skin, and creates a hierarchy. That's a shitty truth, but it is. Yeah. And so they really kind of just pointed out how, there was this group of chefs in Miami that they called themselves the Mango Gang. Almost all of them were white, but they kind of quote unquote created this cuisine called New World cuisine, which was essentially like a combination of Afro-Caribbean, Cuban, South American dishes, which to white folks is like, whoa, I've never had these flavor combinations. Like, what's a plantain? You know, like,
That sounds hella yummy.
I mean, absolutely. And it was incredibly popular. It was incredibly popular. And so, but the restaurants were not owned by the people of that culture. It was like the heads of the restaurants were white head chef having their prep cooks and dinner cooks creating their own cultural dishes, and they were the ones with the ideas, right, of the flavor combinations and the new dishes, but they would not get any of that credit.
Yeah.
And if they wanted to create their own restaurant, it would never see the same kind of commercial success as calling something New World cuisine, and that, and that being in this like kind of more upscale dining environment, and that wouldn't happen in the same way if someone from that culture was just starting their own restaurant. And one way to escape this was for some of those folks to open up food trucks. So that has really helped, I think, in terms of giving folks the opportunity to work for themselves and to not be sort of stuck in that trap of being the creative driver, but getting none of the recognition in creating those dishes for the restaurants. Yeah, it was sort of this example. It was a really interesting example of just sort of how seemingly the only way to kind of legitimize a culture's food to Americans was if it was marketed by white people.
Yeah, that tracks.
Yeah. 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 It was just, and they used a lot of parallels to Columbus, which I thought was a really, really beautiful example of just, of calling it New World cuisine, acting like their discovery of this historical food was some sort of new thing at all, and then benefited from the knowledge and the labor of the folks from that culture, without getting anything back, right? Because they were still there.
Yeah, I have a hard time with this. Is again another gray area, and I think there's always a gray area. Some folks are just passionate about their food, passionate about food they love. It's the aspect of not calling it traditional, not sharing the culture, because it's a whitewashed restaurant. It's not like restaurant. It's a whitewashed restaurant. It's not going to be like a Cuban restaurant. It's not going to be, Cuban themed with the music and everything.
It might be.
Or I guess it could be.
Yeah.
But it won't be.
Cubans wouldn't eat there. White people eat there.
Right. It doesn't give back to the Cuban community. No. For me, that's where it crosses that line, because you can meet somebody that just is so, regardless of their skin color, is so in love with a food or in love with an art piece, or that they hold that standard, that they hold it up as, put it on a pillar and make it beautiful, make it delicious, market it beautifully. But when it comes to credit and
Mhm.
culture, that's where, for me, where that matters, where it's like,
Yeah.
give credit where credit's due.
Sure. No,
You
exactly. I
know?
think that's the difference between like cultural appreciation and learning from a culture and cultural appropriation, which is
Mm-hmm.
just straight up stealing
Stealing
and
is
giving
not okay.
no recognition. Yeah.
Yeah.
At least that's where I see the line. I mean, I would love to hear other people's perspective of sort of where that line
Right.
should be.
Yeah. I have a hard time with cultural appropriation, and you and I have talked about this like
Mhm.
off camera quite a bit, because it is difficult to know where that line is. Like,
Absolutely. Yeah.
I love aspects of Black culture, but sometimes I feel like I can't partake in them because my skin is so white. But I don't
Mhm.
want to be a cultural appropriated. I love this culture. I would never be like, this is something new I've found, you know?
Mhm.
It's
Yeah, it's tough. Yeah, it's a huge gray area.
yeah.
Right, because yeah, to some extent there is absolute beauty in the fusion of cultural ideas and sharing information. And how else can we grow as societies and cultures than by
Right.
learning from each other? That
Yeah, otherwise we're separate and we stay separate. Is the goal to stay separate?
no.
Exactly. So how we need this cross cultural pollination in this way.
Yes, but
But
why doesn't it but it's never the other way around.
no.
And that's the issue. I think it just
It's like part of the issue. It's just like,
mhm,
if you love something, love it wholly, not as like this element that you steal. Love it as like part of a tradition, part of a culture, part of something, and
right.
prop up the whole culture. And if what you love is also suffering, like, hold that, offer your love to the suffering. Don't just take it and take what you love and walk away. That's not
Right. I mean, yeah, I think that that's the hard part for folks because that actually requires work and thought in honoring history and traditions and it's, it's more comfortable for white people to simulate the experience um, of that history and the origins of something than it is for them to actually honor and retain the original culture. Like, I think, and you know, and this is like there's something there's what's called cultural heritage tourism where let's like probably an interesting example is probably like some of the plantation houses in the South. They give tours, you know. Um, I imagine that the things that they teach in those tours is a very glossed over version of the true events. And it's likely told through the eyes of the white person. Um, and if there is potentially some aspect of that is told through the perspective of the enslaved people in that area, it's probably softened where it's
yeah.
made for it to be more comfortable for white people to learn about.
Right.
And yeah, I don't really know where I was going with that, I suppose, but like that's the reality that we're sort of living in, though, is that like
Right.
yeah, everything is centered around what's the concept? White fragility.
Yeah. The white
Right.
experience, the like eggshells, so our feelings aren't hurt by the bullshit that we did in the past,
Right. Right.
like we have to we have to examine that, we have to look at it.
Right.
And
But at no, like, and I think that what I'd like to see is that yeah, why don't these restaurants that are so clearly utilizing a food of historical significance to a particular culture, why is that not recognized at all? Why,
right,
like, why?
why wouldn't you put that? Isn't that super cool? Doesn't that make it more special? And
but that story needs to be told by someone of that culture.
yeah.
And perhaps that's the issue, is that the owners of these places don't necessarily want to give a seat at the table to someone of that culture. They just want to say, oh, well, I learned about barbecue. I've been barbecuing my whole life. It's an American tradition. It's like, okay, well, you're not wrong, but you're way
Yes.
glazing over.
Right. There's a whole history.
Right. Yeah, it's a tough, it shouldn't be that tough, but it is, and it's politicized, and it's
Yeah.
yeah. In this part of the book, pardon, they kind of didn't say that there was any solutions, that they really were just kind of addressing these injustices. Hold on. Tickle in my throat. And that really, I think that the end was just sort of like, you just need to ask yourself why, and like ask questions and recognize when this is happening.
Yeah.
It definitely made me Google the owners of the two barbecue places that I most frequent in my town, one of which is a white man and one of which is a person of color. And so I'm probably going to choose the person of color's restaurant moving forward. As an individual, I can make that purchasing decision based on this information that it just kind of opened my eyes to.
Yeah. I
But
think that's cool. And I think that's what we need to do, right? Is like when you make a choice, look at the value and behind your purchasing choices. And when you're as it relates to like the restaurants you go to, and especially if you're frequenting them, if they're in your hometown, we have this it's not the same because African culture in the Netherlands is quite a bit different than Black culture in America. But there's a Greek restaurant here, and there are two Greek restaurants in my town, and we also did that. We looked it up. We go to the Greek restaurant that the Greek people own. Like and we go to the Italian restaurant that the Italian guy owns. Like we try really hard to make those choices because it matters. The food is also better. Like just in general, there's more love in it when it's a connection to someone's culture. I think
so. And yeah, because I mean, every decision that we make when we're buying something, has the power to essentially say, I support this or I don't support this.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and I think that is interesting research to do, to see like, yeah, who owns these restaurants? Who are, is this,
Mm-hmm.
are these people that are just clearly appropriating culture, that are, or these
Yeah.
people that have, perhaps immigrated to this country, or the Netherlands or the States, and are running
Yeah.
a family owned restaurant. Like, that's incredible. Like, we need to
Right.
be more conscious of supporting these businesses that are the livelihood of generations of historically marginalized people.
Yep.
And that's kind of the gist of this portion of the book.
Okay. I like that. I like that as an end of just being aware and conscious of who we're buying our food from
Mm-hmm.
and how they're treating the traditions that they come from.
Yep. Yeah, history and food matters, and it's something, yeah, that we should sort of be aware of. Yeah. So I think that this book was really awesome, though. I would definitely recommend it if you're interested in learning about the history of essentially Black foods, or food, the sort of
History and
intersection of food and culture and history and
justice.
race. Yeah.
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 Yeah. Highly recommended. And I'm glad we split this up into two different, because it feels like there's two different ways to look at this book as well. So
Yeah. I mean, it goes over a bunch of just smaller individual topics, but yeah, I think that it was interesting to kind of see that, yeah, the second half definitely more so focused on a lot on giving those examples of appropriation, which was interesting. Yeah.
yeah. Well, that is Black Food Matters. If you like
Mhm.
this content and you want to follow us on the journey, please subscribe.
Yeah, we would really appreciate it. Yeah. And I think we will come to you next time with a bit of a transition episode.
Yeah,
And
just like a quick overview because
yeah, this
this
topic
is
is never going to feel over, because it's something, yeah, I think none of them really do, and that's okay. But yeah, food is a big one, because it's something that's a kind of a constant.
yeah, it's the basis of everything we do
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and
So
everything we need. So it is a really big topic.
yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure where we'll transition to, but we will figure it out. And so stay tuned for what we're going to research on and dive deeply into next time. So
Yeah.
yeah, thanks for
Thank you.
watching. Yeah.
Yeah. Bye,
Bye.
guys.